For 4 centuries, justice has eluded our nation. Now, a decade of Black Lives Matter protests puts injustice at the center of national debate. The eyes of the American people are open, and the reality of police brutality is indisputable. We are here today because the lives of Black people, including Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Mike Brown, and Trayvon Martin, they all matter. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Anamika Dwivedi. I'm a team member at the Square One Project at Columbia University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second Justice is the Next Normal town hall. Although white supremacy has tried to silence the voices of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, trans, and people of color leading the fight against injustice, these frontline solutionaries have built momentum for change. We know that what this change actually looks like on the ground will make all the difference between window dressing and wholesale reconstruction. Today, we will talk about how we can reimagine safety in the United States so that safety isn't about calling 911, but instead about communities having what they need to thrive. This event is part of our Justice is the Next Normal campaign that is all about shaping justice in a post-pandemic America so that we end the notion that policing and safety is one and the same, so that we no longer have one justice status quo for white America and another for everyone else, so that our democracy actually embodies our highest ideals of justice, so that we abolish failed policing once and for all, so that Black lives truly matter. We have an incredible group of leaders joining us today, with Square One colleague and Austin Justice Coalition organizer Suki McMahon moderating our panel. But first, kicking us off, I'm pleased to turn it over to Tracy Mears, legal scholar at Yale University, and Pat Sharkey, sociologist at Princeton University, two of the foremost leaders on criminal justice in the nation. Tracy and Pat, take it from here.
Thanks, Anamika. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Pat. How are you?
Hey, Tracy.
Good to see you. So I thought it might be interesting for us to start this conversation about reimagining justice by talking about the roots of injustice, the structure of inequality in this country that you've written about for your entire career. I'm really familiar with the academic books. Other folks might be more familiar with some of the popular writing you've done recently in the Times and the Atlantic. I was wondering if you could start by giving us a sense of the background of the different kinds of inequality in this country and how they're created, the government's role in producing those inequalities.
Yeah, that's really what I think all of this stuff we're dealing with right now, including the reaction to George Floyd and the continuing issue of the coronavirus. This is all part of something bigger, and that's kind of one way to start this conversation. So the article that I wrote in the Times with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and Irina Cerquez, the basic point there was that all of these issues become a little bit clearer, at least make a little bit more sense if we consider that Black and white Americans still live in entirely different social worlds. And so we kind of told that story just from a descriptive level, how different Black and white communities are in the US across a whole bunch of different dimensions. But the second piece is that we created this world. Our social policy in the US going back a long way is a social policy built on division, separation. And that started, way back with Jim Crow and with racial zoning restrictions, and then it continued with red and yellow lining neighborhoods, with the construction of the interstate highway system, with urban renewal, and then it continues to today. Okay, so it continues with exclusionary zoning, with segregated school districts and classrooms, and the emergence of gated communities and so forth. So all of this stuff, all of these policies are the basic argument is that our social policy is not designed to solve big problems. it's designed to allow select segments of the population to avoid those problems, to create separation, to quarantine those problems in particular communities, and then to restrict access to areas of opportunity. Okay, and I think that kind of backdrop, that social policy backdrop, is important for kind of situating all of the events that we've all observed or taken part in over the past few months. Because as a result of all of that, there are these very glaring, severe, long-standing differences in just the daily experience of living in a majority Black neighborhood versus a majority white neighborhood. And it means that police violence is concentrated. So for me, growing up in a largely white community, this was completely unfamiliar to me. It was not clear to me that it was possible for the core institutions that are a major part of my life to fail me, to not serve me, okay? And so police violence is concentrated in particular communities. Disease, pollution, joblessness, economic dislocation, poverty are concentrated in particular communities.
Mortality, everything.
Yeah,
right?
right, exactly.
Criminal legal system disparities are concentrated with health disparities, are concentrated with wealth disparities, and so on. Sure.
Yeah, so I think all of that is becoming visible to a larger segment of the population right now. And, that may be part of why the sentiment for change is so widespread right now. And this all then becomes encapsulated in these debates about policing and the criminal legal system, because we have relied so heavily on the police and the prison to solve all of these challenges that America has not solved through investment, has not solved through large-scale social movements. So that's where I think we now get into debates about what's the next model, what's an alternative model. And I should tell everybody who's watching, I have consistently referred to Tracy as the Biden administration czar of policing. This is a new position that's going to be created particularly for Tracy in about 5 months. And so as the czar of policing, I want to hand it to you and say, what does the next model look like?
Well, I think I have a job and I really like my job. Just want to say that. I think what's really interesting when you think about how to answer that question is to understand fundamentally what it would mean to pursue safety, which goes back to what you were just mentioning. I wrote a piece in 2017 in the Boston Review in which I said policing as we know it must be abolished before it can be transformed. And part of the reason why I was making that argument is I was focusing on the set of public goods to which citizens are all entitled in order to ensure that they are truly safe. And when people are looking to safety, they don't simply care only about being safe from each other in terms of private predation, violence. They care about all of these other things that you were mentioning. They care about having access to good schools and housing, and they care about being able to access healthcare, and they care about being able to be safe from police access, right? And government access. And all of its forms. And one of the things I think is very telling along those lines is a piece by Joe Sauce and Veshla Weaver, who argued in the annual review of political science that for many people in concentrated places, the police are our government, is what they said. But of course, the government is designed, we hope, to produce important public goods. And so in order to think about what policing should look like, as Tom Tyler and I argued recently in The Atlantic, I think we have to start with what it would mean to secure safety and work from there. And I think one of the things we would seek very clearly is that if that's your goal, is to produce true safety for all citizens, you would understand that sending armed first responders to every problem is not the solution. We're going to talk to some other panelists who we know today already. The many communities have figured this out for themselves. Your own work suggests this too. When you actually ask the people who experience both problems of violence and police excess, they come up with solutions that don't simply rely on sending armed first responders and, the kinds of the National Guard, the things we're hearing coming out of the White House today. That's not the solution that they come up with. But it's also the case that we have not invested as much in all of the things that those communities need. And that's been true since the Kerner Commission. It's been true since before that, but we've known it clearly since the Kerner Commission, and still this country has not actually, has not paid the debts on the situations that it's created. So I guess I'm deflecting the question, but to my mind, whoever is czar of police should have, depending on how you understand what policing means, that's an important point, should have a very small job. The last thing I'll say, it might be worth mentioning this, that there is another way of reconceptualizing the police power legally. It is the same power, by the way, that allows governments to respond to the pandemic that we are responding to right now. It is the same power in which governments require students to achieve certain levels of education. It's the power of the states to legislate for safety, health, and welfare of the citizens. And that's the conversation that we really need to have. I'm informed by all kinds of things, technocratic solutions, but also informed by our history. Why, and as we turn over to the next session, why don't you mention, it might be good for our audience to hear some of the ideas that you've seen in your own work, where what we see when communities themselves actually are able to control and dictate the project of safety for themselves.
Yeah, well, I think this is, when we shift our perspective from thinking about, okay, how do we dismantle or defund or exact revenge against the police, to the broader question of how do we create safe and strong neighborhoods, then I think that pushes us to kind of consider a different set of actors and a different set of institutions. And so a big part of the reason why that conversation often doesn't go very far is because I think people don't believe that other actors or members of the community or local organizations can play a central role in dealing with the problem of violence. And I guess I always point to specific studies because I think by now we can say with confidence that view is wrong. These are not just feel-good stories about programs where there are these saints who are out there doing good works. They are saints in many cases, but the work that local organizations are doing to create stronger neighborhoods, to retake public spaces, to look out after neighbors and community members is extremely effective in controlling violence. And these programs are not often evaluated all that well, but when they are, they show extraordinary results, including programs like Becoming a Man in Chicago, after-school programs combined with cognitive behavioral therapy, the Philadelphia Horticultural Society's program to redesign abandoned lots, which was done in a randomized fashion and reduced violence in those lots by 40%. Summer jobs programs. There's not a huge amount of evidence, but when we've actually taken these programs seriously and given them the resources to do their job effectively, and then evaluated it rigorously, the results are pretty overwhelming. And they say that we're so reliant and we have such a fixed idea of who can respond to violence, but that perspective is really limited. The community residents and organizations have tremendous capacity to control violence, but we've just never given them the same commitment and the same resources that we give to the police and the criminal legal system.
Well, one of the things I think is really interesting about what you said is, we're talking about community-based solutions to violence. And we're talking about that because, whenever people talk about reducing the footprint of police or abolishing them entirely, the immediate response is, well, what about violence? But of course, we know that police do a lot of other things besides responding to and addressing violence, in many cases, as you've already noticed, not very well. I know in my own city, The vast majority of police calls are not to respond to violence. That, of course, raises another possibility for, thinking about what policing means differently. But I do think that the really huge challenge here is thinking about, safety from the ground up, where we don't take a long-term view of the problem. So even a lot of the defunding solutions are saying, well, let's have a different kind of first responder come to certain kinds of situations. But I think that reflects what you were saying, Pat, about we're always responding after the fact and then trying to separate people from a problem rather than attacking the problem itself, right?
Yeah, so you can think about who responds to all kinds of calls for service, but instead of that, you can also think about who's out in public space, looking over public spaces, making sure everybody's welcome, making sure everybody's taken care of, making sure no one slips through the cracks, making sure problem areas don't develop within a neighborhood, that there are establishments that are not creating problems in a community. And so, one of the biggest changes is that we primarily rely on the police to patrol a neighborhood.
Right.
And I think there's just the capacity for lots of different members of a community and institutions within a community to play that role in looking out over public space. So before we get to any calls for service, who is the dominant presence in the community? Who is looking out over public space? Who's making sure everyone is cared for and is welcomed within that community? And if there are not strong institutions and people in place with the resources, the investment that they need to do that, and the training that they need to do that, then we become dependent on the police to respond after the fact. And I think it goes to the broader question of how do we build stronger neighborhoods with stronger institutions? And that's a first order question. And then the second order question is how do we respond to, and it's obviously not a trivial question, but then how do we respond for calls for service after the fact, and which people, which actors are in the right position to do that as well.
Exactly. And then, of course, even if we had that kind of, better vision of guardianship, it still doesn't address the question of how the other key institutions that are critical to safety, what is the housing department doing in a city? What is the state's vision of funding schools, throughout an entire state? What does that look like? What is the minimum wage in a state so that people can actually have a living wage? All of those things, of course, are critical to safety, and they need to be integrated in this conversation. Well, we've just blown up the entire conversation. I think our conveners are going to want to bring us back to a question of policing, maybe as we understand it today, a little bit more closely. So I think we're going to be joined now by a bunch more people. Here's Suki, and I'm really excited to talk to them.
All right. Thank you, Tracy and Pat, for kind of giving us a springboard for this conversation. I'm Suki McMahon. I'm from the Square One Project, and I'm also a leader at the Austin Justice Coalition. So along with Pat and Tracy, we are joined by Heather Ann Thompson, who's a historian at the University of Michigan, Jamal Cole from My Block, My Hood, My City in Chicago, and Ron Davis from 21CP Solutions, and he's based out of Oakland. So everyone here today has been involved in the Square One Project in some way or another in the last 2 years, and we come from all around the country. So this group is somewhat representative of the multidisciplinary people that we bring into this discussion about reimagining justice and narrative change in the United States. So I'm grateful that we can be in this space together, and even though it's virtually, I'm glad that you're all here, so welcome. But first I want to bring in Heather, because you are a historian, and at Square One we start out all of our roundtables with a historical overview of the subject matter. And a few years ago, for a roundtable, you wrote this amazing paper on the racial history of criminal justice in America. And that really situated policing within a broader context of historical racism and white supremacy. And you argue that these inequalities and injustices that we're seeing today have a history that's 4 centuries old. So can you walk us through that a bit?
Thank you so much for having me here. Well, as you say, needless to say, this brutal situation that we find ourselves in today is not new. It doesn't spring from whole cloth, and certainly the injustices and inequalities that Pat just chronicled, they're literally baked into the DNA of this nation. And even a cursory study of our history really indicates that these inequalities and these injustices, really not the lofty principles of liberty and equality and justice for all, are baked into the DNA of this nation. And the 400-year history that you mentioned is just rife with examples of that. But I want to be more specific for this conversation, because I think that we need to be really clear that these injustices and inequalities have been maintained and allowed to multiply and have been perpetuated, not simply by osmosis or, passively or via some sort of benign cultural transmission. If you look closely at the history, it's really clear that they are maintained by really active policies of criminalization and very actively by the act of policing. And I think it's really important to understand this, is particularly where we are today, and if we hope to make a genuinely different future. And particularly as we're having conversations with what does that mean for policing. From my point of view as a historian, you cannot look at the past without recognizing that policing has been really central to maintaining both the racial and the economic hierarchy, to keeping it intact, protecting both whiteness and capital, to having very little to do with public safety. And this is really an essential thing to reckon with, because to begin with this notion that it's about public safety and that somehow that this is where we start and that this is what we need to perfect and that this is what we need to kind of tweak to get it right, misses that 400 years. It misses the fact that throughout history, every time that there is a challenge to that hierarchy, a bid for true equality, racially, economically, the response is always criminalization. And the response is always to criminalize the challengers, to police them, and ultimately, of course, to imprison them. And there are countless examples of that, from indigenous populations to Mexican Americans, Native Hawaiians. But if we just look simply at some more perhaps familiar stories, say right after the Civil War and then more recently after the Civil Rights era, after the Civil War, 4 million African Americans who are making a bid for true equality economically and politically. And the response to that on the part of white Southerners is to immediately criminalize all Black spaces and to police Black spaces. And lo and behold, say in the state of Alabama, the prisons go from being 1% African American to, by the 1880s, 85% African American because of that policing. Not because white folks stop committing crimes, not because spaces become less safe, but because literally this is about policing racial and economic hierarchy. And essentially the same thing happens after the Civil War. And I think we have to just be really clear about this when we start to have conversations about what does it mean to reform the police, or what does it mean today if we're going to think about policing in a new way. Because what it suggests is we have to think about questions of violence in new ways, questions of public safety in new ways, and questions of criminalization and what role criminalization plays become really front and center in our discussion, because it's no longer about policing as a gateway to safety. It's policing as a gateway to status quo. And it just shifts the conversation so fundamentally that I think we need to have that conversation if we're able to then have the conversation that we were just having about, what would it mean in a new administration, for example, to reimagine policing? And so I'll just throw that out there and open it up to everyone else. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Yeah, I want to bring everyone into this discussion. I'm hoping it's kind of a free-flowing discussion, and let's dig into that. We know that we're coming from a 400-year history of policing as conducive to racism and white supremacy, and what are the implications for that history to making change now? So let's just kind of jump in on that, and whoever would like to make a comment, please do. I'm going to punt it over to someone. So I'm going to punt it over to Jamal, because Jamal, I keep track of all of our roundtable participants, and I get a Google alert, I think, every day about your organization and the work that you're doing in your community. And, when Pat is talking about the increase in community responsibility and the need to invest in the community, I see you guys doing micro grants and feeding your community. So talk to me a little bit about your sense of this, why that's important for you and your community organization to take that on.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you guys for having me. I think democracy starts from the block level. I don't think it starts from the city level downward. The mayor doesn't demand that you get to know your neighbor, you know what I mean? But if you want your block to be safer, you have to demand that of yourself. The aldermans don't demand that you pick up the trash in your alley. But if you want there to be less rats born in your alley, you should demand that of yourself. The senators don't demand that you go to Springfield, the capital, to advocate for education reform. But if you want there to be per pupil tuition funding, if you want that to be equitable across the city, you got to go down there and demand that for yourself. So I feel like we all know who's on Trump's cabinet, but don't nobody know who their neighbor is. And, I can't, we always say that you ask somebody, why is your neighbor look like this? They say, oh, the government's messed up, the city's messed up, the police are messed up, the schools are messed up, the economy is messed up. I mean, I think that philosophy is messed up. My philosophy is like something that took me 10 years to develop, but it's really 15 words that I always ask people. Those 15 words are, what's something simple I can do that'll have a positive impact on my block? That's what's something simple I can do that'll have a positive impact on my block. And I'm telling you, you don't have to have a master's degree to make a difference. You don't have to have a law degree to listen. You just have to have a heart full of passion and a good soul, and you can make a difference. And so I encourage people to do little things. When there was all the looting happened, it essentially turned my community into a food desert. We were already going through coronavirus, but now seniors have to go 20 minutes away to a pharmacy or 15 minutes away for some eggs, And so we started a small business relief fund to raise money for businesses that were looted. And, we raised $1 million in a couple of days, and we're dispersing those funds. If it snows and the city is overwhelmed, we shovel for seniors. If it's a heat wave, we deliver fans, we deliver food. Through coronavirus, over 5,000 seniors reached out to us from 12 different states, and we were able to provide them with, first, a lot of them were lonely, number one. They needed a call, but a lot of them needed to be connected to primary healthcare physicians, or they needed food or disinfectant spray or hand sanitizer or whatever they needed. We just connected them, So everybody says that what I do is very simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. But I also feel like it's all I can do, because it's democracy. The wheels of democracy seems like they take so long that it's frustrating. You can't even build a website without somebody having to get 3 signatures. So it's like, I'm just gonna go out there and just knock on my neighbor's door and see how I can help. And that's pretty much what I do.
That's it's wonderful work, and I think that it's an interesting thing, especially for Black-led community organizations like mine in Austin. Suddenly, it's all eyes on us. There's a lot of support from the community, a lot of requests for help from the community, and I do get a sense that it increases safety in our community when people aren't hungry. When there's someone that they can point to and say, that person, that group over there is here to help us. And we don't have to do anything violent or anything that is illegal to help ourselves, because so much crime, I feel, is a direct conduit of just the deficiencies of all these other areas. We're starving out there, and I think that these community organizations, with the right investment and the right time to operationalize and to build out, are really kind of going to be that next nexus for safety. Ron, you talk a lot about reimagining justice and the ways that community involvement in policing can really change that whole dynamic. I remember hearing you talk about this a few years ago, that this doesn't happen enough in policing, that kind of this co-production of policing is essential for safety. But we're also talking about this next story, this next element of the story. Do we co-police in the same thread that we had a few years ago? Is it possible to co-police in that way, with the community and the police sitting down at the table? Or, as Tracy said, is it important to first kind of break things apart and then see what's actually needed?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the question. I kind of lean more towards what Tracy is at, which is, you heard me say over the years that when people tell me the policing system or our criminal justice system is broke, I quickly remind them that I don't think it is. I think it works very well. It works as it was intended to work. Disparities are part of the system that was baked into the system. And so you create police, as Heather mentioned, to enforce discriminatory laws, to maintain status quo and white privilege. And so you have systems now that we're still operating the exact same way. And when you have systems like that, that even good cops have bad outcomes, and bad cops get to operate with the community. And so one of the things I've always appreciated with the Square One project was that there's a tendency, I fall guilty of it quite often, to want to tinker around the edges and fix that which is not fixable, versus to deconstruct and then reconstruct a system based on reimagining public safety at large. And in that one, I think we can then redefine the role of police in that public safety scheme work. And so I like the idea of communities at the local level sitting down trying to figure out, what does public safety look like? Who controls those public spaces? I think Pat nailed it perfectly. Whoever controls the public space controls the quality of life for the people that live in that neighborhood. If gang members and violence controls it, people live in fear. If the police control it, people feel oppressed. The only people that can control that public space is the community, and that the police should help facilitate that control, if you will. So I think we do have to reconstruct a system that looks at public safety much larger than crime and violence. It looks at everything from COVID-19 to economic viability to social conditions, and really then invest the money where it's going to have the greatest return on the investment. Now, the only thing I do caution as we rebuild the system is that the system was following a political direction, and the system was following even a community value early on. And if we don't start changing some of our own community values and our political system, we can reconstruct the system, but it will still be guided by white privilege and the ability to protect status quo, but just in a different and more creative way. So we got to do more than just change policing. We got to reimagine public safety, and we got to change views of the community and quit over-relying on enforcement as a public safety tool that starts looking at the role of the community, a much stronger role in public safety, and to start holding elected officials accountable for the direction that they give. And if I just close with one part from my point, and the biggest one is just to quit defining law enforcement as the sole agency responsible for crime rates.
Right.
There's nothing more counterproductive than to hear an elected official either hire or fire a chief based on some statistical crime number. So we fired a chief, the homicides didn't go down fast enough. So let me get this straight. You have a 19% unemployment rate, a 40% dropout rate. You have no jobs. You have no opportunity. Young men feel like their lifespan is not going to go past 25. And let's go ahead and fire the chief because he or she didn't reduce homicides. And if you put that on me as a 35-year police veteran, then the only way I can be successful is to use that system that was designed to contain and to oppress and apply that system into the neighborhoods most affected by crime so that you get your statistical crime reductions. We got to redo this whole idea that when crime goes up, it goes up because we have done something or not. When crime goes down, it's because we have done something to either address those social conditions. So this reimagination has to be bigger than the police. It's the criminal justice system. And quite frankly, to Jamal's point, it is down to people doing simple things to make their lives better at the block level every day.
Yeah.
Suki,
But
could
we
I
also have to, we also-
sorry.
We'll do Tracy, then Heather, please.
I just wanted to connect what Heather was saying to what Jamal was saying and like tie a quick little bow, like 10 seconds, which is to say that all of the incredible work that folks like Jamal are doing all around the country, you know, where you're organizing people doing small things, they're doing some of these small things in part because there have not been resources put into their communities so that these people can actually have access to services and the like that they need. And also that the government services that are structured are not designed to provide them with those resources either, right? So, you know, one thing to say is that, you know, organizations like his shouldn't have to rely on their own lights, their own bottoms, their own resources to get this done. And that's consistent with Heather's history and also consistent with the kinds of things that Pat and I were talking about. These community approaches have been around for a long time, but they're severely under-resourced. There has not been sort of a national investment in these kinds of strategies. And that's politics.
Heather, do you want
I was
to
gonna
piggyback
say-
on that?
Yeah, I think there's also two just really important rhetorical interventions that we need to make in this broader policy discussion. And one of them is about this. I think it's a long history about Black and brown criminality, which is now kind of this trope about, you know, inner city violence. And it's sort of this inevitability about inner city violence that, you know, there's always going to be violence, there's always going to be gangs, and so therefore there always must be police, or what are we going to do about it? It's kind of this inevitability. And what people are really just stressing so strongly is, no, there's nothing inevitable about this. And it has to do with opportunities, and it has to do with resources, and to just to hammer that home, it's just critical, because for so long in the policy discourse, it was just a given that these poor communities would be violent communities. And so then it was just a question of throwing up your hands and what kind of a policy response would you have to this violence? And, you know, so would it be more police, or what would it be? There were always going to be gangs. There's always going to be violence. I think we have to just fundamentally dispense with that. And the second piece of that, and it's related, is to get communities who are affluent to start telling the truth about what works in their communities. And there is nobody in an affluent community talking about bringing in more police. There is nobody talking about increasing law enforcement solutions. Everyone is talking about resource-based solutions. Everyone credits resource-based solutions for the successes of their communities. And so to start having these policy discussions, to be more honest in affluent communities about what makes them tick and what makes them work, and to step away from these kind of essentialist, violence, criminality-based discussions, you know, it just, those are what drive the only solution being, gang enhancement squads or zones or wherever. And I think that this is the most important thing we can do, is stepping away from these essentialist notions of what the solution could be, or the note that some solutions work for some communities but not for others. We know what works. Every affluent community knows what works. They implement it every single day. And when their kids fall afoul of the law, the last people they call is the police, and the last place they want their kids to go is prison. They figure out community-based solutions, and they're always based on expanded resources. And so share it with everybody else.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather, for kind of shedding some light on that. Ron, I once heard you say that policing is not the tip of the sword when it comes to community safety, that it is the community. Here in Austin, we launched a We Fund tool, and the community overwhelmingly supported alternatives to public safety, violence prevention centers, survivor resource centers, harm reduction centers. And there's a sense that there are models for these things around the country, and sometimes in the cities that we're in, and we're trying to uplift those. And Pat, you mentioned some of these different model organizations out there in the world. Why do you think it is that it took until now? I feel like now there's a hard look at how can we replicate these things. What do you think's been the holdout all this time?
So this for me, you mean the holdout from replicating some models of refunding or defunding or reallocating services?
And this is for anyone, but I was directing it at Pat, but I would love to hear your response.
Pat, I'll come back at the Pat then.
Well, I wanted to hear Ron's response, but and Suki too. Suki, what you've done in Austin is just so inspiring to read about. So I'll say something quick, but then I want to turn to the people who are doing this because, so one of the things that people don't realize is that most crimes are not reported to the police. Over half of crimes, if you trust victimization surveys, people don't report most victimizations to the police. So what that tells us is that this is already going on. People are resolving conflicts. People are de-escalating situations. People are responding to problems and challenges that their neighbors have. We do this, okay? And the problem is we don't value it as a society. We don't value that work in local problem solving, and we don't value it with public resources. So, like Jamal, when I hear about your perspective and the work you're doing, it is so inspiring to hear about. And then I think about my situation, and I was in Manhattan for 12 years in Greenwich Village, and not once was I asked ever to do something, to volunteer my time to help with a problem down the street. So I do some of that, but I was never asked to do that. I was never asked to volunteer my time to go out and try to mentor a kid from my neighborhood. I was never asked to give my time to go to a public meeting about an issue with violence or a problem spot in the neighborhood. So what I'm saying is we devote a huge amount of resources to law enforcement and to the criminal legal system. We should place the same value or greater value on the people and the local groups like Jamal's group, like Suki's group, and that are solving problems and that are making communities stronger and safer. And we should value what they're doing with the same resources so that Jamal's staff, everybody's paid and they're paid well. They have the time to do training, they're professionalized, and that can be a job that supports a family for a full career, okay? That's the kind of investment that we make in law enforcement, okay? If you are a paid police officer, you have a stable job with a pension and you can support your family with it. We need to support street outreach workers, mental health crisis teams, counselors, after-school program coordinators with those same resources. We need to value that work in the same way and with the same resources that we give to law enforcement and representatives from the criminal legal system. Okay, that was longer than I wanted to talk, but I want to hear about what's going on in Austin and the work you've been doing, Suki, and hear from the people who are actually doing this stuff that I just talked about in abstract terms.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the money aspect that you mentioned too, because these groups are woefully underfunded. It's usually writing on volunteer work for a really long time until they're able to even staff up. Here in Austin with this We Fund tool, the folks are asking for a 54% cut in the police budget, and for all of these other alternate forms of public safety to give rise in this moment, because they feel that that's where safety will live for the foreseeable future, and that's just something we've been afraid to really dig into and to realize. Mental health first response is one of those. having a fourth option when you call in to 911, EMS, APD, or police, and mental health first response, as well as fire. Like, that's something we don't have. I don't know if your communities do, but we really don't. And it has led to so many senseless deaths when you send out guns to a medical problem. It needs a medical response. And so we're pushing and we're advocating for these different areas where we know that the outcomes are usually very poor, and especially for people of color. And I know that Jamal is doing similar work to uplift his community, and I think to really make it safer so that our interactions are really reduced when it comes to policing. Honestly, in Austin, we talk about a world without police, and we really try to envision what that might look like. That there's this conversation, as you all know, about defunding and directly about abolition. And in several cities like New York and LA, they're reallocating funds from police budgets to community-based support. So let's talk about this movement to defund. What are your thoughts on that? Again, as I mentioned here in Austin, that is what is actually at the top of everyone's mind. Our city manager reduced the police budget, but a tiny, tiny amount. It's like he didn't read the room at all. But we're working on that. We're having budget hearings this week, and we're really pushing people to go and to speak about their own experiences, but what they know as a teacher when it comes to violence prevention for their students and so on. So I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on this movement right now. It's a movement for the times. So Tracy, oh yes, Ron, please.
Yeah, I'm going to give you just a perspective as a former police chief.
Great.
But first, to the question, you had a question about why we don't have a really look at former model. Let me start with that. Because the way we define public safety has been statistical crime reductions for the last 30 to 50 years. And statistically, we have some of the lowest numbers since the 1950s and 60s. And it has become comfortable and easy for society to just keep over-relying on police instead of building new structures and systems and community-based responses, to just say, hey, crime is down 5%, 10%, 20%. This is the lowest crime rate since 1950, 1960. And we created this and fed this monster that now absorbs for most cities 65+% of a general fund. And we haven't gone to the core conditions that create crime and social disorder. We just responded to the symptoms and been playing whack-a-mole for basically 5 decades. But the idea of the funding, I think it makes sense that you need to allocate the most resources and the services that would give you the highest return on your investment. In that case, you have to reduce the law enforcement footprint. What I hope communities do, though, they need to walk through and figure out where they're going to invest that reallocated funds to, and make sure that those services are actually effective, that will give you return on the investment, to figure out how long it takes to ramp them up in order to get that return on investment, to come up with a transition plan that does not step into inadvertent problems. So, for example, if someone says cut your department by 54% today, then you have to know the 85% of that department's budget is personnel costs, which means the only way to do that is to lay off cops, which is maybe a response. But if you do it with most civil service rules, that means the last ones in are the first ones out. So you just got rid of all your new diverse and analytical millennials, the things we've been fighting for a decade now, walk out the door because you cut the department without a strategic thought. So I think as communities are deciding these numbers, it makes sense to do what they're doing. It makes sense to reallocate. It makes sense to reconstruct and deconstruct the system. It may even make sense to redefine what police even look like and whether that's the title of the future. But we got to do it in a way that makes sure that we transition and that we are putting the money in the right places. And one of the things that I think we have failed with community-based organizations over the years is that we have not connected them with academia, with the Tracys and the Heathers and the Pat, to do the kind of evaluations and the research to show what kind of impact they really do have on public safety.
I think that we not only need to reallocate the funding into areas that we know, and through myriad studies, what creates public safety, which is education and opportunity and lack of hunger and shelter and housing. So not only do we need to reallocate funding for that, but we also know that we need to deal with harm in different ways. And we need to deal with social ill in different ways, because every time there is a police call, it results that when there is some kind of trauma or some kind of harm, that results ultimately in arrest, that in turn results in a prison sentence, we have a whole nother crisis on the other end, which is mass incarceration. And we have more people locked up in this country than any other country on the globe. It is not just broken, it is catastrophically broken. The trauma that it results from this criminal justice system, from the incarceration end, which ultimately, or I should say the origin, is the criminalization and the arrest and the policing. I mean, it's all one thing, but you can't have prison without policing. You can't have the policing without the arrest, and so forth and so on. We got to rethink the whole thing, because the way it is right now, I live in the city of Detroit. On the east side of Detroit right now, we have 16 people living under correctional control. We cannot talk about rebuilding a community. All the people in the world with good hearts who are there working every single day trying to build community are scrambling up a hill by themselves, when we are at the same time arresting people and imprisoning them. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to respond. It doesn't mean that we don't need to, that people don't need to take responsibility, or that violence isn't real, or that harm isn't real. It just means that we got to figure out a different way to do it. And the thing is that there are models. There are models in all kinds of communities of how we deal with harm. There are models in other countries of how we deal with harm. But we have to think of different models. And yes, defunding is a key thing we need to start with, but it's beyond defunding, because at the end of the day, when a law enforcement officer shows up at the house because harm has happened, it's going to end up in prison, and that itself is reason enough to rethink this right now. We've got a crisis, and defunding is the tip of the iceberg right now, I think.
I want to say that, when I think about defunding the police, I've been pulled over in Indiana, I've been pulled over in Wisconsin, I've been pulled over in Nebraska, in Wahoo, Nebraska. And, I got pulled over in Wahoo, Nebraska, and the cop pulled me out of my car, and he sliced open my seats with a razor blade because they thought I had drugs. And they put me in the back seat of a cop car in handcuffs and drove me through a cornfield. And, it looked like, I was hitting every side of the car. And we pulled up to a barn, and I seen two greyhounds come out, and like big dogs. And they tied me to a radiator, right? And I'm an author, right? I'm a writer. They were saying I was selling drugs. I'm an author. And I was thinking, like, this is crazy, right? And it's interesting, like, my great uncle was the first black cop in Houston, Texas in the late 1940s. And he joined the police force, at a time where racial discrimination was systemic. And outright discriminatory too. I don't mean like today's discrimination that's cloaked up in fancy words and rhetoric. I mean overt. Like my dad says, they don't even say the nigga word the same as they used to say it. They used to say it with so much ferociousness. They don't even say it the same no more. But my uncle, he had to work foot patrol in a predominantly black neighborhood because black cops weren't allowed to drive squad cars. They had to take the bus to work. He had to seek his supervisor's permission if he wanted to arrest a white person. And if he wanted to arrest a black person, he had to put him on a bus to take them to the station. Right? This is a fact. Right? I think a lot of the police officers don't even know the history of the police department, or definitely don't know the history of the communities that they serve prior to policing it. You should be able to fall in love with your neighborhood before you start policing it. One of the things we do in my block, my hood, my city is called youth-led tours of the neighborhood. And I was pleased to see that in Chicago, if you want to be a cop, you have to have 1,000 hours of training. There's 900 mandatory and 100 that are electives. 5 of those hours go through my block, my hood, my city. And all the cops, the cadets, the new ones, have to take youth-led tours led by the stakeholders in the neighborhood, which are the youth. So it's police officers, state's attorneys, and kids that are getting to know each other and having collective problem solving. They can, hey, here's 16th and Kedzie. They got the best hoagies in the city. This is Sal Hoagies where I eat every morning. Hey, this is my block, or this is where I go to school at. This is where Dr. King lived when he was in North Mondale. Like, this is what the cops have to do before they police the neighborhood. So again, I agree with defunding the police when I think of putting money into community programs. But as a community person that started a community program and whose home went into foreclosure starting a police program, I'm interested in working with the next generation of leaders to stop trying to be sustainable. Like, that's where you go crazy at. Like, what are you doing for sustainability? Like, that word to me is crazy, because it's like, it's impossible to even if you take government funding, do you know that they will ask you for a survey for impact? You only got to, like, I'm doing the work. My hands is dirty, but they want you to show some kind of metrics of how, what is your theory of change? What's your synergy opportunity? Like, somebody asked, what are your in thrive points? I said, what the hell are you talking about, man? Like, I need money. Like, give me some, let's meet each other on stream. So I say all that to say, like, I'm a lot of times I'm frustrated and jaded, but at the same time, man, I'm telling you, once you give up on that word sustainability and you just start doing the work, I don't know how it works, but I'm telling you, the universe will connect you to people that will help you. I don't know how it works, but I'm telling you, if you do what you're passionate about, it kind of like you build relationships with people that'll help you carry on the work.
That's brilliant, Jamal. And, I find it interesting that, working with the youth and bringing up this next generation, it's something that every community, I think, has, especially for Black youth. At AJC, at Austin Justice Coalition, we have higher learning, and it's for Black and brown kids ages 5 to 18. And we're bringing them into this space because the idea is that you go to school and all day, every day, it's don't do this or else. And we know what that means. We know about the school replacement pipeline. We know the stats and all of that. They don't. Those little kids don't, but we do. And so we have a mentoring program that's based on community service and based on anti-racism. And we really help these kids to write their own narrative, not to take what they've been given, but to understand the systems and why this thing is happening to them and what they can do to push back against that. And again, it's self-liberation, really, giving people the tools and from a really, really young age, say, this is what we've been dealt. This is what we've inherited, and here's how we're going to work our ways out of that. So I think it's interesting. We do not do tours. I think that's a really brilliant idea. I think they would love to take folks around their areas and to show their laundromat and the places that they go and their favorite little, food truck or whatever that is. I think that's so smart.
Hey, Suki, I think Jamal just gave us a warning that I think I want to maybe highlight, if I may, Jamal.
Sure.
And that is, I saw this when I was a director of the cops office and putting out hundreds of millions of dollars in grants. There's a science to writing grants, and what's happening is too often, way, way too often, the organizations that are on the street, on the ground, doing the work, do not have the capacity to write this science, these proposals that end up getting the funding. And now with all this focus on reimagining public safety, going in the community, it's going to create a new industry. There are a whole bunch of people who haven't been on the ground at all will show up to start writing fancy grants to try to get the funding. Academia and these leaderships, we got to get behind these organizations. And if they need science, let's provide the science for them. Let Jamal do what he do, right? And we let us write it up so he can get the funding necessary to make the change. Otherwise, someone's going to come in and just write a nice fancy things with matrices and all the stuff Jamal already told you and get money. So we really got to make sure we identify those grassroots. I used to drive me crazy as a police chief because I knew who was on the street doing it every day. And they couldn't get a grant. I mean, it was hard to get them funding because so many false barriers were in the way. It was just unbelievable.
Yeah. And even a step farther than that, let's do some real work on income equality so that those communities don't need the grants to get that basic kind of equity in the community. Not every community's got to get a grant to get some basic resources in the community, right? To get books in schools or to get, boots on the ground for whatever kids need. And that's about income inequality. And that's about, getting paid enough in the workplace. And so that's why that whole discussion about defunding the police or what needs to happen next has got to be unrealistic, but it's not crazy. It's not pie in the sky. I mean, we're literally talking about going to some more income stats that look more like 1964. We're not talking about, some crazy, let's take us to a different country in a different universe, some sci-fi channel. Like, we're literally talking about the Great Society here compared to right now. So it's doable, and I think this is the time for that imagination, so that it's not all grant funded. It's actually a little bit more in the what kind of paycheck someone takes home when they actually go to work every day.
Yeah, I want to say too, like one of the number one questions I'm asked all the time is, when are you going to make the jump from being a community activist to being a politician? I get this so often. It's annoying to me. Like, when are politicians going to make the jump from being elected officials to being public servants? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not trying to be a politician. Like, you know what I mean? Like, stop it. Like, I feel like we're the new politicians, the people that are social activists. We're not trying to, have a gavel in our hand and be in City Hall. Like, that's not the new move, but most community organizers end up running for an office, and then it changes, right? And so I think people are jaded from even seeing you doing the work. So I think that I just want to highlight that, because it's like President Obama, his the way he won office was my whole master's degree. That's why I took a master's degree on is internet marketing, and how he won the campaign by smaller donations, how he used analytics, how he used AdWords, how he, how he built his website, right? And I used everything I learned and put it into community. And now, President Obama is a great inspiration to me, but now he's doing community organizing. And so I just think it's interesting, like, he made it all the way to the pinnacle, but now he is putting so much money into community organizers, not only from Chicago, but all around the world. So I think I'm interested in making sure that the next generation of leaders see social activism, or whatever you want to, community organizing, or building a nonprofit organization. I don't even like talking about it as grassroots, because stuff like that, the words nonprofit and grassroots, turns kids off, and we want to nonprofit. Bro, I'm from the hood. I don't want to be nonprofit. That don't make no sense. I don't like those kind of words. So I'm trying to change a lot of those terms.
I would say I agree with you, but a small cautionary tale. If some of those newer, younger leaders are not willing to be legislators and government leaders, then we do have a fundamental issue. Because as Heather mentioned, for example, police as we know them, they enforce the laws that legislators pass. And if we don't have people in the legislature actually talking about front-end accountability, actually restricting the kinds of laws that police can enforce, actually requiring that there be a living wage, actually changing the shape of public schools as we know them, all of that is done fundamentally by legislators. And if that doesn't happen, there's not a lot that the community organizations can do within neighborhoods other than respond to the situation that we have.
Yeah, I get asked that same question a lot too, Jamal, and I'm like, I thought y'all were my friends. Why would you ask me to do that? But, a lot of the work that we do at AJC is policy work and legislative work. So it's, at least we have that avenue to our legislators to push them and our policymakers to push them on these issues. And it does help to have a Black informed, racial equity based policy. But I also hear you, Tracy, that it's important to have that inside outside game as well. And it's good to have allies in there. That's when we count our votes, first and foremost are the allies that we have in there. So, but Jamal, it's not sexy, and it's hard to convince people to come and do it. I can say that's for sure too.
No, they say, oh, we do work in the community too, Jamal. We just don't bring our cameras with us like you, bro. You spend $200 on elections, $200 million on campaigns a year. Like, you know what I mean? This is what people do to run for office in Chicago. Like that, we talk about defunding police. We should defund some of these politicians and how they get all this money to run for office. Like that's, if every community organization can get a fraction of that money, Lord of mercy, man, I just feel like we should be investing in community solutions and seeing if they should be expanded into broader strategies as well, man. That's and this, it's not for everybody. I agree. It's not for everybody. Like my forte isn't politics. I'm still struggling to understand the Constitution and what it means to be an American citizen. I'm hearing the president wants to put federal troops in Chicago. I don't see how that's what, promoting general welfare or domestic tranquility. I don't understand it like I need to know it. So I'm looking forward to learning. I'll work with anybody though. I'll tell you, I'll work with anybody for real.
This is Ron. This is my Judge Jamal. I think, well, keep doing what you're doing, and I agree with Tracy. We do need leaders like you to take the reign, because here's where when these decisions are being made, especially for the young activists out there. I just remind you, it's great to be on the street and to march and to protest. And I think there's only two kinds of protests that are unacceptable: there's silence and violence. Everything else should be into play. But understanding governing matters greatly. Showing up during the budget process is amazing to me. When I spent a year as a city manager, that communities may be yelling and screaming all year about not having services, but then two people in the audience when I'm passing a budget with the city council. Or basically that when I'm negotiating a contract with the union, you have 10,000 that's protesting about the controversial or the killing or the murder of a person, and rightfully so, but then two people show up at the council meeting when we're passing a contract with the union that may prohibit me from talking to an officer 2 days after he shot and killed somebody. We got to basically take this to the streets. We got to take it to city councils, elected officials, Congress. And a part of this is understanding the governing part. And I really do hope that we can excite more people like you, Jamal, to get involved in that process and start leading it, so that these things are not done in the darkness of night and hidden behind executive sessions, and that we have a whole new generation of leaders. So I'm not going to say you personally, but just get people like you that may have that desire. Please push them. Please push them.
I will do, man. I will do. I appreciate that, and I'm not saying I'm never going to do it, but I'm just saying, like, to get people to city council meetings. You know how I got people to come to my meetings? Walk in the neighborhood and put my flyers at Subway, or walk in the block and like flyering yourself. Like, if you like, I feel like a lot of those meetings, like, maybe that's actually how we could work together. It's like, hey, well, they come around on election time because they say we have social capital, but a lot of people don't know how they can, they don't know about the meetings. But I love to work with somebody on actually getting, just getting those meetings out to the local neighborhood grocery store and putting it in their newsletter or something, and letting people know, just figuring out how people find information too. But holler at me, maybe we can come up with something.
I think Suki might have frozen there. We might have lost her, but I think we're waiting on Marlon for the next session. I will just say one last word that I think a lot of this discussion revolved around the idea that the people who are part of a community or looking out over a community, that's where the next model lies. Those are the people and those are the organizations that have the greatest capacity to create safe streets and to promote the well-being of everybody in that neighborhood. People who are genuinely concerned for the people in a community, and I think everyone recognizes that. We've just never used that as a starting point for our social policy to create safe streets.
So I want to thank you all. Really, I think this conversation was amazing, and I think we hit so many points. We had a commenter, Nicole, who was saying that communities of color are consistently asked to solve their own problems they did not create, problems that have created ongoing and generational trauma with little to no support. And I think that we were able to speak to that pretty resolutely. I think that we all firmly agree with that. We're all talking about these alternatives and what that roadmap looks like and what the models are out there. So I just want to thank you all for really being generative and adding to this conversation and to this Justice is the Next Normal event. So I want to thank you. Y'all are great.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm just gonna introduce Marlon Peterson, who's been involved with the Square One project since the very first roundtable. So Marlon is the founder of Precedential Group and the host of the Decarcerated podcast, and he's in Brooklyn. Marlon, can you hear me? Everything good?
I hear you clearly. How you doing, Suki?
I'm doing okay. I'd love to just get your thoughts on what you just heard, first of all.
Yeah. First of all, I hope you and your family are okay and well, and for the other panelists as well. Hope you're doing well. There's a lot happening in the world, and I'm happy to be a part of the conversation. My thoughts on what just occurred. It's interesting to hear those different perspectives, particularly listening to Jamal. The first time I've heard from Jamal, I've heard of him. The first time I ever got to him speak, and I hope to get to be able to meet him and work with him at some point in the future. Folks want to do something, right? People want to do something differently. And you see that by folks consistently being in the streets. You see what's happening in Portland. Keep an eye on Portland, please do. And I think that because folks want something to happen, folks are asking for something radically different, right? Completely different. And, in some ways, I don't think it's radical. I don't think the idea of abolition is a radical idea, to be frank with you. I think, abolition in the lineage of so many other folks who have been proclaiming this and coming up with ways to do it and have been implementing it in their own neighborhoods, communities, village, towns, have been thinking about ways to create something different. I was thinking sort of about, when shadow slavery was still happening here in this country and folks were screaming for abolition. Folks weren't just asking for the end of the institution. Folks also, part of the end of that institution meant folks wanted the opportunity to live full and self-actualized lives, whatever that meant for them. And I think now when we hear folks speaking about the idea of abolition of police or abolition of prisons, I'm not saying now, just because it's in the news now. When folks say it now, folks just ask for opportunity to create what they want for their neighborhoods without being in harm, right? Folks are actually identifying one of the major factors of harm in their neighborhoods. Law enforcement, they have identified it, and I often say, particularly in this round of time, is that I think Heather and Thompson alluded to it, but nothing we're saying now is new. This conversation is not new. The statistics are not new. The reports are not new. You go back to early 1930s, late 1920s with the Wickersham Commission. Like, these things people have been exposing the problems of law enforcement, particularly in Black communities, for a long time. But the other thing is this, Suki, I think oftentimes when this conversation of what safety is or reimagining safety, safety is just not safety from being shot, right? Because the fact of the matter is that most people in Black and brown communities are not being shot. And I say that with a tinge of sensitivity, right? Particularly here, I'm in Brooklyn. 2 weeks ago, 1-year-old was killed, and then a couple of days after that, another person was killed just 2 blocks away from where that baby was killed. So I'm not saying that the harm isn't happening. What I'm saying is that, as I always say, violence is a visible display of a lot of other things that's already happening. There's a lot of other things that we need to sort of define as issues of safety. So COVID-19, this pandemic, we are saying it, but once again, I said before, our analysis is not meeting our practice, or our practice is not meeting our analysis, actually. We have seen now that COVID-19 has exposed all the other issues in our communities, all the other issues. These are safety issues. You know why they're safety issues? Because people die. You know what I mean? People die from this. That's what we're afraid of, right? People die from this. And when I say our analysis is not meeting our practice, we are conditioned to believe that safety only means being free from being shot or being robbed or being sexually assaulted, which are real things, which are things I've all experienced personally, right? Personally. What I'm saying is that we need to sort of define it differently, because we're entering the conversation from a wrong place. And that's what I think is what folks have been saying for so long. When we have been protesting in the streets, not only in this moment, but you can go back to generations back. The March on Washington was for jobs. It was for jobs. People forget that it was for jobs. That was one of the things that folks needed to take care of themselves, right? And we lose that. We lose that. Folks have been asking for remedies, and for other remedies that can qualify under the umbrella of safety. And I think that these conversations now have to be started from there, not from by police. Police know that. Police know they can't stop it. Police ask a cop, Ask any officers, and they will tell you, we can't stop crime. We here to, we here to, when something happens, we come to arrest somebody, but they don't stop it. You know what I mean? I think, interesting enough, right? I don't know if you have another question, but I'm kind of going on a tangent. But, there's a New York Times article that came out a couple of weeks ago. I said police spend 4% of their time responding to violent cause of violence. 4%. That means it's 96% of the time they're doing other things, traffic, noise disturbances. So even in the data supports that the issues that, like, police are not necessary for all the things that they say they're necessary for. And so, I mean, that's in terms of what I've heard from the conversation. I'm happy that, some of the folks on the call, on the Zoom, on the chat, this is not Zoom, this is something else. The folks on the chat, I've been in conversation with before, and I'm happy to hear them. They're still here and engaged and still leading. And I think just for the folks watching or listening to this, if you hear anything, if it's one nugget you take out, is that safety is not synonymous with police and violence. It's not the same thing. There are other things that we Black folks have been asking for, have demanded for, have been resisting for, have been creating by our own intuition, our own prerogatives, to help and support ourselves. I mean, the Black Panthers did that, right? They did that. That's what they figured out ways to take care of their community, to make young folks feel safe, to make, in terms of, for them being able to eat, the breakfast program. That was them taking care of the safety of the inside of the child, but we don't see it in that way. And I think for these conversations, we need to see safety differently.
Yeah. And you're here to talk. Usually you're doing the interviews, and we don't get to hear as much from you. So I'm glad to be in this position where I'm asking you the question. So, you talked a lot about safety. Is that to you the central organizing principle for this moment, for this movement? Is that what grounds us right now? No,
I don't think that grounds us right now. I think we're living in as Ron had alluded to, this is bigger than police. Right? I mean, we see that in the streets. We're toppling down statues and whatnot. And we have people who are saying, no, we need to have these statues up and put them in jail for 10 years. Once again, that becomes a safety issue. Toppling down the statue means we need to engage the criminal justice system. I just wanted to people to understand what's happening in real time, right? But no, I think what's grounded in this moment, I think about John Lewis, right? The elder who died last week. And, he has said in his speech at the March on Washington, which folks, once again, we like to romanticize folks and whitewash, but I'm gonna read just a part of his speech. He said, we are tired of being beat by policemen. We are tired of seeing our people locked up in jail over and over again. And then you holler, be patient. How long can we be patient? We want our freedom, and we want it now. I think this moment is enshrouded in those sort of sentiments. Right, that we want freedom. This is a freedom conversation. This is a legacy of Black folks demanding freedom in this country. That's what this is. That's what this is grounded in. We got nothing to lose about our change in this moment. I think that policing has always been the most visible actor in terms of state and violence and social inequities. And they always tend to be the catalyst, right? And you think about all the uprisings that we've had in the 20th century into the 21st century, most of these uprisings have been catalyzed by law enforcement. And that should tell us something. Yeah, so when we look back on this moment, because I sense it's big, I feel like it's this transformative moment that I hope that's where we are, and I hope that I'll be a part of that. But how do you feel like this moment is going to live in history? How will it be recorded? This is wishful thinking, right? Yeah. Wishful thinking conversation. It's big. It's reimagining, and we speak it into being, right? Yeah, we at a place of heightened consciousness, right? More people are connecting the dots beyond just the police, more than just the prisons, more than even sometimes who's currently in office. We're seeing this legacy. We're seeing this legacy, and I think, in this moment, I think about how we would be remembered. I guess it's the inner narcissist in us, and me maybe think about how how we remembered in this moment. And I hope we're remembered as being unwilling to repeat the past. Yes. Right? We need to be unwilling to repeat what happened before. We need to be willing to do the different thing, and not, and risk it. Right? When we think about the idea of defunding law enforcement, abolishing prisons, abolishing police. That's a different thing in terms of the actualization of it. And the reason why I say we need to not be afraid of doing a different thing is because, for one, I just sort of think about just statistically, when you think about violence as one of the components of safety, outside of the recent uptick that we've had in cities, and there's reasons for that, right? There's real reasons why we've had this uptick. It's not just because police decided they want to sit back and watch folks kill themselves. That's not why. Folks were in the house for months on end, watching, experiencing death of mothers and aunts and grandfathers, essential workers, sacrificing time, being separated from them, having less money in the house because of being laid off or furloughed, being stuck in small and close environments. Like, all those things are happening as to why this is happening too, right? I just want to be clear about that. But I think folks, particularly now as we are here, in the summer in 2020, I want folks to realize that the idea of these new and amazing ideas can't do any worse than what has been done to us already, right? And I'm saying that because oftentimes, as you all were discussing earlier, what happens to harm? What happens when this happens in the community and the police is not there? Who are we going to call but 911? Statistically, people don't call 911 because of violence. Not that often. And there's reasons why people don't report. Understand that, right? But for the most part, the statistics are saying that. Or I'm just going by what those statistics show. But also the issues in which that harm people, that bother people the most, are not the interactions where they feel threatened by a weapon. You know what I mean? And I want people to sit with that for a minute. Sit for that. How many times have you, and I'm saying not only you, but people listening, watching, how many times have you called the police? Right? Take a survey of your friends and family in your community. How many times have you all called them? Right? And if you have, for what reasons? Mm-hmm. People are creating policy in our name, saying the reason why we need to increase police budgets, or at least keep them the same, or we can't reduce it by that much, is because you all keep calling us. They're doing that in our name. And I want us to be aware of that, right? But the other thing is this: I think we are very capable, Suki, right? The other day I was speaking to a friend of mine who wrote an interesting article in Truth Out, and I think it's appropriate for this is, as we think about social workers, social workers are not now to be replacing police. I just want to throw that out there, right? As we're saying we need some more social workers. Their job is not to replace police. You should check out the article by a colleague of mine, Dr. Kirk James. But this particular friend of mine also served 8 years in prison, and we were hanging out this other day, and he was talking about the experiences when he was in there, and he was speaking about the facility that he was in was one of the most violent ones, period, right? And then I asked him, well, you were able to not get involved in that sort of stuff. I asked him, what did safety look like for you in that violent environment? And he thought about it. He said, I never thought about that. But he's like, I was able to be involved with this sort of program. I started I had opportunities to enroll in school. Safety for him was bigger than what was happening in that prison yard, right? And I just want people to understand, I went to prison a whole decade and never had a fight. How is that possible? You know what I mean? And the reason why I bring those examples in is because we are capable. I've seen us do a lot in some of the most volatile spaces. I've done a lot in the most volatile spaces, right? And I think as a community and just being out here, and I've been involved in, gun violence prevention work that didn't involve police, right? As a violence interrupter and still support that sort of work. We are capable of creating the communities we want. I say that like a broken record everywhere I go. We are. And I want people to believe that I believe it, because, if you sit down and you sit back in your own apartment, your own house, sit down in your office, and you really think about the things that you think about a Brownsville, Brooklyn, you think about Inglewood, Chicago, you think about Inglewood, LA, you think about these communities, there are people who are able to do things in their community. Jamal is doing amazing thing in his community. Now, suppose he's resource better, right? Because here's the thing, I know we're getting long-winded, but I always compare to Silicon Valley, right? Or these folks who, what's the word? Entrepreneurs. What's the type of capitalist?
Venture capitalist.
Venture capitalists, right? And they invest millions of dollars in people every day, in projects, and a project flops, and the person comes back and they get another project, and the project flops and they get another project, maybe that one works, with no accountability. But when it comes to us in our communities, you have to do all this reporting. Where are your metrics? Why don't we have the opportunity to fail also, is what I'm saying. We don't have the opportunity to fail. And I think that's hindering like the fullness of us living a self-actualized life, right? So that's what abolition is, the ability to live a self-actualized life in so many ways. And that also means not only in abolishing these state systems that harm us, but also removing the barriers that allow us to abundantly take care of our own neighborhoods.
Marlon Peterson, everybody, just amazing. We have to close out, but I was gonna ask what inspires you and what gives you hope, but I'll just say you inspire me and you give me hope, and I'm going to be resting with this term that we're capable is something that's where the hope lies to me. Like, we're capable. We can do this moment. We can handle this moment. There are people like you and there are people like the panelists that are out there that can help to inform this moment. We're not going in blind.
I want to do something.
Yeah.
I'm just off key, but like I always keep this, right? I always keep on, you can get this off the internet, right? That's what I did. And there's a picture of Malcolm X when he was young, obviously Malcolm X later, and like he was a violent dude. Before, like Malcolm was a violent dude in a violent neighborhood, right? In Harlem, right? In terms of, and with a lot of social inequities. And he was able to transform Harlem in the world in so many ways. And I think that we need to not only see these people as like these divine, bigger than life figures. Malcolm was a dude from the hood. And you know what I mean? And I think we need to be able to see like we are capable of the same thing. And I think like white folks and white institutions need to be able in this particular moment, one of the things was different about this moment, historical moment, white institutions need to be able to sit down. I think that's very important because nobody can fight for us like we fight for us. Nobody can love us like we love us, right? And loving us means that we loving everybody. It's not just like black folks and brown folks and indigenous folks that, well, we gonna love us and all the white folks. Nah, no, we want a less tense, a more peaceful, a more safe environment, period. You understand? I mean, that's the lineage of black people as well, you know? And we're capable of that, right? But I also just want to like that nugget, like some institutions need to sit down at this moment. It's very important in this moment.
I could literally listen to this all day, but I know that we have to close this out. But this won't be the last time that we'll have these types of conversations. You've been a steady partner and a family member for Square One all of these years, and I'm just so grateful that you lend your voice at this moment and in the past as well. I think justice is the next normal. I think we're moving towards that, and thank you for being here today. And we'll talk soon, maybe in person even. That would be nice. Yeah.
Thank you. Take care of yourself as well.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for watching.